A lot of people tend to think of Alzheimer's as, something that someone gets and almost instantaneously they may die from it or something. But these data here are to illustrate that the progress of the disease is slow and burdensome. The biological changes that lead to Alzheimer's have been found to begin 10 to 20 or more years before you begin to see the symptoms in the clinic. And for people who are age 65 and older, they survive an average of 4 to 8 years after their diagnosis. And some people may live, as long as 20 years with some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Now, if you're at age 80, approximately 75% of the people with Alzheimer's dementia are living in a nursing home, compared to only 4% of the general population at age 80. All of this is why Alzheimer's contributes to the significant public health impact, and I'll get to some of the numbers in terms of cost later on in this presentation. So as I mentioned, the disease does not develop overnight. There are biological changes that happen 10 to 20 years before we start to see the symptoms in the clinic. So the initial stage of the disease, or kind of the stage before we can see anything happening, is called the asymptomatic phase, where you don't see any cognitive symptoms, but the biological changes, so the changes in the amyloid and the tau that are associated with the disease, and I'll get to that later, have started to happen in the brain. Now, the earliest clinically detectable stage of the disease is known as a stage called mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. You notice that I use very, very specific language there because there are other causes of mild cognitive impairment. Now, while we do call this mild cognitive impairment, some of the changes can be pretty serious. So the individuals who get mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease may progress into dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. Again, using very specific language there because there are other causes of dementia. I know I don't want to hammer this point home, but I'm sure you've probably heard in previous presentations that dementia is kind of an umbrella term, and Alzheimer's is only one of several causes of dementia. Now, the individuals who get dementia due to Alzheimer's disease will progress through the mild, moderate, and severe stages of dementia, each one associated with more and more interference with the activities of daily living. And as I mentioned earlier, these brain changes may begin 10 to 20 years before the symptoms appear. Now, all of this begs the question of what impacts someone's risk of developing Alzheimer's or cognitive decline in general? So we can divide the risk factors into, and again, we like to think of them as risk factors and not necessarily a cause, because that's the big question people always ask us. So what causes Alzheimer's, right? But it's more than that. There's so many factors associated with impacting a person's overall risk of developing dementia. So the two kind of big classes of risk factors are the non-modifiable risk factors. These are things that you can't change. So these are things like age. We know age is the biggest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. Genetics, we currently don't have tools to change a person's genetics in the ways that will allow us to impact a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia, as well as race and ethnicity and sex and gender. We also have the modifiable risk factors. These are things that can be changed. So these include things like your environment, where you live. We know amazing work coming from Amy Kind in Wisconsin has shown that, your zip code has significant impacts on your health outcomes. Your diet is important, sleep, and I'll talk about a few of these modifiable risk factors later on in the talk. The amount of physical activity you get, and even your level of education may all play a role in your risk of developing Alzheimer's or the dementias. Now, while I've kind of dichotomized these so nicely on this beautiful wheel here, there's a web of complex interactions that impacts a person's overall risk of developing dementia. We need to think of this in a life course perspective from birth to death. What are the things that happen to an individual across that timeline that may impact a person's risk of developing dementia? This is why we think that the constellation of reasons may be fundamental and unique to each individual. And there's so much coming out having to do with social determinants of health that may impact some of these risk factors as well. Now, this points to the need to study the risk of developing dementia from all angles. Now, given what I've just told you about these modifiable risk factors, it begs the question then, what percent of dementia can we prevent by targeting these modifiable risk factors? And the Lancet Commission published a report in 2020 focused on modifiable risk factors. And what they found was that up to 40% of global dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting these modifiable risk factors. Now, that is impactful considering that, globally, there are about 50 or so million people who are living with dementia. This number is also expected to rise. So we sought to answer the question, is there a specific recipe that may reduce the risk of someone developing cognitive decline as they age? Now, that's where the US Pointer study was born. So the US Pointer study stands for the US Study to Protect Brain Health Through Lifestyle Intervention to Reduce Risk. Now, this is a 2-year multi-center study. It's happening in 5 geographically diverse US sites. Now, it's a randomized controlled clinical trial. So the recruitment target was 2,000 participants, and that's what has been seen in some of the the drug trials that have led to some of the treatment approvals that we've seen in recent years. And the individuals were 60 to 79 years old, and they were at risk of developing cognitive decline. The two intervention groups were more of a self-guided, you go ahead and do this on your own, or the structured intervention group, a lot of the times, right, we all know that we're supposed to, not eat ultra processed foods or get 30 minutes of exercise, but do I do that every day? The answer is probably no. So having a structured intervention group kind of helps with adherence to the protocol. And the domains that they were targeting include physical activity, nutrition, intellectual engagement, and health coaching. Now, the recruitment for the US Pointer study finished back in March last month. Or we're still in April, right? So last month, and it was very encouraging to see that 30% of the individuals who were recruited in the study were from underrepresented populations. This is historic and monumental because, as I mentioned previously in some of my slides, a lot of previous studies have not included individuals from underrepresented backgrounds, and a lot of the sort of complaints or the pushback that we've received in the field is that this is difficult to do. However, through our commitment to working with and for communities, we're able to achieve this percentage of underrepresented populations, and also demonstrating to the field that this is possible with the right commitment and the right partnerships. Now, the US Pointer study itself started as kind of the core US Pointer study looking at these lifestyle intervention domains. But since then, it's other ancillary studies have been added, including the Pointer neuroimaging, which is looking at imaging, looking at the brain while people are still alive. Pointer ZZZ, which is looking at sleep. And remember, I mentioned that's one of the modifiable risk factors that influence a person's risk of developing cognitive decline. They're also looking at the blood vessels around the brain and the Pointer microbiome. So we're learning more and more that the bacteria in our guts have huge impacts on overall health and may play a significant role in changing how the immune system works and how that may impact the person's risk of developing dementia. Now, Okay. I mentioned also that there's some biological changes that happen before a person develops Alzheimer's disease. So in a healthy brain, this is a schematized view of what the neurons look like. The little spark there are these connections between the brain cells called the synapses, and that's how the brain cells talk to each other. And that communication is what gives rise to pretty much everything that we do. So our ability to talk, our ability to move, ability to handle our activities of daily living. However, in an Alzheimer's brain, we have the two hallmarks of these amyloid beta plaques that are a protein that is associated with the communication between these brain cells. However, in the disease process, too much of it gets produced, and it starts to misfold and clump up. That clumping up leads to changes in the brain that then lead to the also clumping up, but this time inside the cells of the brain of this tau, and this forms the tangles. So these amyloid beta plaques and these tau tangles, in concert with other processes in the brain, including things like inflammation, lead to the death of the brain cells. Now, these brain cells are no longer talking to each other, and depending on which part of the brain that they're in, that leads to the symptoms that we see in the clinic when someone has cognitive decline. So in order to defeat a disease, it's really helpful if you're able to catch it early. And for over 100 years since the disease was described, we did not have tools that allowed us to diagnose Alzheimer's while people were alive. So in 2001, the Alzheimer's Association funded Dr. Bill Klunk at the University of Pittsburgh, and he came up with a compound known as Pittsburgh Compound B. Now, this compound is a tracer that allows us to see, that binds to these amyloid plaques and allows us to see the amyloid while people are still alive. So that's what's seen here in the beautiful red and green image, with the red showing the hotter regions where there's high levels of amyloid in the brain. But since then, the field has exploded with tools that are a research on tools that are looking to help with early detection and accurate diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. I'll talk a little bit more about blood tests, but those are in very, very active development. And people are looking at all sorts of things, including the genes that are differentially expressed when someone has Alzheimer's, people looking at the eye. And a couple of days ago, I even saw that people are looking at changes in people's voices to help with diagnosis of Alzheimer's. But when I say that we're targeting this from all angles, that is truly what is happening in the field right now.